Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question that landed in our listener mailbag.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and it really took us down a bit of a rabbit hole. What exactly is happening with nanoplastics when they get into wastewater treatment plants?
Right. It's a big question.
We found this fascinating scientific study. It's out of Australia that really drills down into this.
Okay.
So our goal today is basically to trace these incredibly tiny plastic fragments, through the whole cleaning process and figure out where they end up.
Exactly. And, for a while now, we've been pretty aware of the problem of microplastics.
Right, the bigger bits.
Yeah, those plastic bits smaller than 5 millimeters. But they're even tinier cousins, nanoplastics, anything under a single micrometer, which is, what, a millionth of a meter?
Tiny. Really tiny.
Yeah, they've been much, much harder to study, especially when you're trying to figure out, how much mass of this stuff is actually moving through these treatment facilities.
Okay, so this study we're looking at, it took a different approach, didn't it? They weren't just counting particles under a microscope.
No, exactly. They used a pretty sophisticated technique. It's called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry, or Pyr-GC for short.
Wow, that sounds intense, like something out of a lab in a movie.
It's very precise. Basically, they heat up samples of the wastewater from different stages of treatment.
Okay.
And that heat breaks down any plastics that are present into smaller, identifiable chemical bits.
Ah, I see.
Then these components get separated and analyzed, and that tells us the mass concentration, how much weight of 9 common types of plastic polymers.
9 specific types?
Yeah, the ones that exist in nanoplastic form. And they did this across 3 different wastewater treatment plants down in Australia.
That feels like a really significant step forward because, like you said, most of what we knew before was based on just counting these tiny, tiny particles.
Exactly. This gives us a sense of the sheer weight of these pollutants flowing through the system.
So let's start at the beginning then. Where did they first detect these nanoplastics? In the raw sewage?
Yep. It all starts in the influent that's the raw, untreated wastewater just as it arrives at the plant.
Right.
And the study found, quite a range of total nanoplastic mass concentrations right there at the start. One plant had 27.7 micrograms per liter.
Okay.
Another had 18, and the third one had 9.1 micrograms per liter.
Micrograms per liter. Okay, that sounds incredibly small.
It does, but you have to think about the sheer volume of water these plants process every single day.
Yeah, good point. Gallons and gallons. It's got to add up.
It definitely adds up.
So what kinds of plastics were they finding most often in that initial influx? Was it all the same stuff?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. The exact breakdown, it did vary a bit between the 3 plants.
Okay.
But some plastic types consistently showed up as the main ones. So at plant A, nylon 66 was actually the most abundant. That was 7.3 micrograms per liter.
Nylon. Interesting.
Yeah. Then followed by polyethylene, PE, at 6.6, polypropylene, PP, at 4.5, and then nylon 6 at 3.8.
Ah. What about the others?
Plant B also saw a nylon 66 leading, but a bit lower, 3.5 micrograms per liter. Then PE at 3.1, nylon 6 at 2.9, and PP at 2.6.
Okay. Similar pattern, but different amounts.
Right. And plant C showed a slightly different mix again. Nylon 66 was still up there at 2.9, but then it was PE at 1.8, PP at 1.7, and then PMA, that's polymethyl methacrylate.
Oh, like acrylic.
Yeah, exactly. That was at 1.20 microgram per liter.
So it really seems like nylon 66, polyethylene, and polypropylene are sort of the big 3 right from the get-go.
They definitely seem to be the dominant players, yeah.
Any idea why those particular ones are so prominent? Does the study give any clues?
It does offer some hints. For example, plant A apparently handles more wastewater from residential homes. Whereas plant C gets a larger proportion from industrial and commercial sources.
Right, so different sources, different types of waste?
Exactly. These different inputs likely explain the variations in the types and amounts of plastics coming in. Think about synthetic clothing.
Like nylon track pants.
Yeah, or fleece jackets. They release nylon or polyester fibers when you wash them. That could be a major source.
Makes sense.
And then there's the breakdown of packaging, bottles and containers made from PE and PP in household waste. That stuff gets flushed or washed down drains too.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So that's the influent. The wastewater goes through intermediate treatment.
Yeah, they call Class C water stage. This usually involves primary treatment, basically removing the bigger solids.
Screens and settling tanks.
Exactly. And then secondary treatment, which is where microbes get to work, breaking down the organic matter.
Okay, so what happened to the nanoplastics at this stage? Did much get removed?
Quite a bit, actually. Across the 3 plants, the total nanoplastic mass concentrations dropped quite significantly, down to 12.4, 7.6, and wow, a really low 0.8 micrograms per liter, respectively.
0.8. That's a huge drop for that third plant.
It is. If you look at the removal rate just at this stage, it was 55% in the first plant, 58% in the second, but an impressive 91% in that third plant.
91% just from primary and secondary. That's pretty remarkable.
It really is. So even these initial treatment steps are quite effective, taking a large chunk of these tiny plastics out of the water.
What's actually doing the removing there? Is it just the physical settling of solids, or do the bugs in the secondary treatment play a part too?
It's likely a combination of both, Primary treatment with the screens and settling tanks, that would definitely remove larger particles that nanoplastics might have sort of glommed onto.
Okay.
And then in secondary treatment, you have that activated sludge process.
Where the microorganisms eat the waste.
Right. Those microbes, or the sludge flocks they form, can also trap or incorporate these tiny plastics. They get caught up in the biological matter.
Gotcha. And then you mentioned some plants, A and B, in this study, they have an even more advanced stage, right? Tertiary treatment.
That's right. Producing what they call Class A water, which is a higher quality effluent.
So things like extrafiltration?
Yeah, things like ultrafiltration, maybe even reverse osmosis in some cases. Advanced stuff.
How did that extra step affect the nanoplastic levels in those plants?
Well, for plants A and B, which had this tertiary treatment, the total nanoplastic mass concentrations in the final treated water, the effluent, dropped even further.
Okay.
Down to just 1 microgram per liter in plant A and 1.4 in plant B.
Wow, so very low concentration.
Very low. Now, plant C, remember, it only had primary and secondary treatment. Its final effluent, which was Class C, ended up at 0.8 micrograms per liter, which was already pretty low after secondary.
Right, it had that big drop earlier.
Exactly. So if you look at the overall picture, the total removal rates were actually very high for all 3 plants. 96% removal in plant A.
96%.
Yeah. 92% in plant B and 91% in plant C.
Okay, that's pretty good, actually. Almost a relief to hear how effective these plants seem to be.
It does sound good for the water quality being released, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But that high removal rate, it only shifts the problem, doesn't it? We're essentially just concentrating these invisible pollutants somewhere else in the plant.
Exactly. That was my next thought. So the treated water looks much cleaner in terms of nanoplastics, but they haven't just vanished into thin air?
Not at all.
So where do all these removed nanoplastics actually end up?
Well, the study strongly indicates that. Pretty much consistent with what we already know about the larger microplastics.
Okay.
The removed nanoplastics are very likely accumulating in the sewage sludge. The stuff left over after treatment.
Also called biosolids, right?
Exactly, biosolids. That nutrient-rich byproduct of wastewater treatment.
The stuff that often gets used as fertilizer on agricultural land.
That's the one.
Uh-oh. So hang on. We're doing a really good job cleaning the water.
Yep.
But we might be unintentionally taking those removed nanoplastics and spreading them onto farm fields.
That's a really critical point and a major concern. Now, this specific study, they didn't analyze the biosolids directly, but the implication is quite clear. This could be a significant pathway for plastics, including these tiny nanoplastics, to get into soil and terrestrial ecosystems.
That doesn't sound good. Are there ways to treat the sludge itself?
There are potential ways. The study does briefly mention that certain technologies like pyrolysis and gasification.
Heating it up really high.
Exactly. Heating the biosolids to very high temperatures, potentially without oxygen, that could, in theory, break down these plastics within the sludge, but that's another complex process.
Okay, so potential solutions there, but maybe not widely implemented yet. Let's zoom out a bit and try to get a sense of the scale here. What kind of daily and maybe even annual amounts of nanoplastics are we actually talking about flowing through these plants?
Right, they did estimate that. Based on their measurements and the average daily flow of wastewater at each plant, the researchers came up with some pretty significant figures.
Okay, lay them on us.
Plant A, which was the largest plant, they estimated a daily input of around 1,743 grams of total nanoplastics.
Over 1.7 kilograms a day.
Yeah, just coming into that one plant. Plants B and C had much lower daily inputs, 72 grams for B and 23 grams for C, respectively.
Okay, so plant A is handling way more, but even grams, like we said, day after day. What does that translate to over a whole year in terms of what's actually released after treatment?
Okay, so looking at the output, the effluent, annually, plant A is estimated to release about 24 kilograms of nanoplastics into the environment.
24 kilos, about 50 pounds, even after 96% removal.
Yep. Plant B releases approximately 2 kilograms per year, and plant C about 1 kilogram per year.
Wow. Okay. Even after those really high removal rates, we're still talking about kilograms of this stuff potentially entering, rivers or oceans or wherever the effluent goes every single year from just these plants.
It's quite sobering when you scale it up like that.
Definitely. The study mentioned comparing these figures to some research in China, right? Were they similar?
They noted some differences, yeah. And there could be several factors explaining why numbers might vary between locations.
Like what?
Well, the size of the population served by the plant is obviously a major one.
Sure. More people, more waste.
Right. And the level of industrial activity in the area. Different factories, different plastic inputs.
Yeah.
Also just different consumer habits, The types of products people use in one region versus another will impact the amount and types of plastic ending up in the wastewater.
And maybe even the treatment technologies themselves vary.
Absolutely. Even subtle differences in how a plant operates could make a difference.
So this study gives us this really valuable data on the mass concentration, which is fantastic, a new perspective.
It is.
But how reliable are these findings? You mentioned the fancy Pyr-GC technique.
Yeah.
What about limitations? Did the researchers point any out?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Good science always acknowledges limitations. The Pyr-GC technique itself, its a real strength, is measuring mass, regardless of particle size. That's a plus. But before they could even use it, they had to prepare the samples. They used hydrogen peroxide to digest the organic stuff and ultrafiltration to isolate the tiny plastic bits.
Right, concentrating the nanoplastics.
Exactly. And they tested how well their method worked the recovery rate by adding known amounts of polystyrene and PMMA nanospheres.
Okay, how'd that go?
They reported recovery rates between 55% and 64%.
So maybe only recovering about half to two-thirds of what was actually there?
Potentially, yeah. Recovery rates below 100% suggest some loss of material during that sample prep process, which means the actual amounts could be even higher than reported.
Okay, that's a big one. What other limitations did they mention?
Well, they noted that their sampling was based on single grab samples taken at specific times.
Right, like a snapshot.
Exactly. Which might not fully capture how nanoplastic levels naturally fluctuate throughout the day or day-to-day or even seasonally.
Yeah, you could get a high point or a low point by chance.
Precisely. They also didn't specifically account for any polymer-based flocculants chemicals, sometimes used in treatment, which could potentially interfere with the plastic measurements.
Oh, okay.
And they focused only on particles smaller than 1 micrometer. So if nanoplastics clumped together into slightly larger aggregates, they might have missed those.
Right.
There's also the point that they used polystyrene and PMA for their recovery tests.
But the main plastics found were nylon and PEP.
Exactly. So the recovery rates for the dominant plastics might be different, better or worse. We don't know for sure from this study. And, just the general possibility of some sample loss during all those complex pretreatment steps.
Yeah, always a risk in lab work.
And finally, they didn't investigate how factors like the plant's overall size or capacity or weather conditions or the rate of water flow or even seasonal changes might influence the results.
So lots of variables still to explore.
Definitely. So while this study provides a really important baseline, a snapshot, it also clearly highlights several areas where more research is needed to get a, more complete dynamic picture.
Okay. So this study gives us some crucial first insights, but it also, opens up a lot of questions for future research to really pin down this issue. Given what we do know now from this, what practical steps can actually be taken? What can be done about nanoplastics in wastewater?
Well, the study rightly points out, and it's kind of the obvious but hard answer, that the most effective long-term approach is tackling the problem at its source.
Prevention, basically.
Prevention. Reducing the overall amount of plastic we use and discard, especially in products that are likely to break down or go down the drain.
Like what specifically?
Well, think about microbeads in personal care products. Progress has been made there in many places, but it's still a factor.
Okay.
And a really big one is addressing the shedding of synthetic fibers from our clothes every time we do laundry.
Right, the nylon and polyester we talked about.
Exactly. Promoting reusable packaging is huge. Encouraging the use of simple things like laundry filters, filters you can put on your washing machine outflow, those are concrete actions individuals can take.
Things we can do.
Yeah. And then on a larger scale, we really need a much better understanding of where the plastics entering our wastewater are primarily coming from. Is it mostly homes? Is it specific industries? Is it stormwater runoff?
Pinpointing the main sources.
Yeah, because once we have that clearer picture, we can develop more targeted and hopefully more effective management strategies. Maybe it's working with specific industries, or maybe it's public education campaigns.
Right. This has been incredibly insightful, really painting a picture of something we don't often think about. So just to sum it all up.
Okay.
Nanoplastics are definitely present in our wastewater when it arrives at the plant.
Yep. Confirmed.
And while the treatment plants are actually doing a pretty impressive job removing like 96% of the mass.
Surprisingly effective in some ways, yeah.
Those removed plastics are likely just concentrating in the sewage sludge, the biosolids.
That seems to be the most probable fate within the plant.
And even with those high removal rates, we're still seeing measurable amounts, kilograms per year from single plants, potentially being released into the environment in the treated water.
That's the bottom line, yeah. Even high efficiency isn't zero release.
And the most common types they found consistently were things like nylon 66, polyethylene, and polypropylene.
Those seem to be the major players in this study, definitely.
Okay, so it leads to this bigger thought, doesn't it? These wastewater treatment plants, they were designed to deal with, biological waste, sewage.
Primarily, yeah.
And now they're also acting as these major filters unintentionally for plastic pollution.
A role they weren't designed for.
Yeah, and this raises a really important question, maybe for you, the listener, to think about. Considering this kind of dual role, what are the potential long-term consequences for our environment? Do we need to start thinking about adding more specialized technologies, like extra filters just for these tiny plastics? Or does this just highlight a more fundamental need for us to drastically rethink how we produce and consume plastic in the first place?
It's a big question. Where should the effort go? Upstream prevention or downstream cure?
Exactly. Maybe take a moment to consider your own contribution, the plastic you use and the often unseen journey it takes after you discard it, maybe through these very systems.
Definitely a lot to think about. If you're curious to dig deeper, we definitely encourage you to explore the ongoing research into the impacts of nanoplastics on ecosystems, on human health potentially, and also what ultimately happens to all that plastic ending up in the biosolids.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until our next exploration.